everyone, and welcome to the IGP's Directors Seminar. This is the beginning of our autumn series. It's lovely to have you with us. We're delighted that you've been able to join us. This autumn series is entitled Rethinking How We Finance Prosperity. And this series seeks to rethink the relationship between finance and prosperity. The term prosperity is often understood in relation to wealth. And in the contemporary world, wealth is often produced through financial capitalism. However, new ideas about inclusive and sustainable prosperity are being co-produced with diverse communities based on what people living in different places really value. This work foregrounds ideas about good work, decent housing, education, political voice, better health outcomes, and working within ecological systems. In order to realize these diverse aspirations, we urgently need new forms of finance, understood as practices, products, ethos that can enable pathways to inclusive prosperity. And so the talks in this series ask how can and how is finance being rethought and reconfigured to produce, circulate, and support value for the majority of the world's population. And various speakers will examine current modes of financing, outline alternatives and visions of what we can and must do differently in order to finance real prosperity. And it's my great pleasure to welcome today the first of the series speakers, Dr. Andreas Hackl, who is lecturer in anthropology of development at the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh. His most recent research explores the growing relevance of digital livelihoods and online work among refugees and migrants in Lebanon, Germany, and globally. And building on this project, Dr. Hackl also conducted research for the ILO's Youth Employment Accelerator under the multi-stakeholder Prospects Partnership to explore the role of digital economies for job creation among refugees and host communities in Egypt, Kenya, and Uganda. And his recent publications include the ILO report, Digital Refugee Livelihoods and Decent Work, as well as an article in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies titled Writing Code, Decoding Culture, Digital Skills, and the Promise of a Fast Lane to Decent Work Among Refugees and Migrants in Berlin. His previous research was on dynamics of labor mobility and urban inclusion among Palestinians in Israel. And alongside his work as an anthropologist, Dr. Hackl has worked as a newspaper correspondent based in Jerusalem and as a humanitarian reporter and analyst for the New Humanitarian. So it's my great pleasure, Andreas, to welcome you today to the IGP. And I would right away just like to give you the floor and invite you to talk to us, please.
Thank you so much for this introduction. I'm just delighted to be here to speak to the Institute for Global Prosperity. I do hope everyone can hear me well. If otherwise, please do let me know. So I'll be just briefly saying that this research I've been working on was a 2-year research project that has ended, but as so often with research, it lives on and it will live on, and publications are still in progress. So in this sense, the work is also still in progress. I will be sharing my screen with you now to jump right into the presentation. Right, so the digital refugee economy, is it an opportunity to leapfrog towards prosperity, is a question I'm posing now. And this question is not invented by me, it has been posed before, and it is invoked by a lot of countries and places that do see the digital economy as indeed an opportunity to, for example, leapfrog towards a more prosperous society, an opportunity to accelerate economic development because of the promises that online work, digital economies, labor platforms, and e-commerce entail. But before we go into these larger issues, I would like to take you to Lebanon. It is Lebanon and it is 2019. And the current economic crisis that we're seeing now has not yet fully arrived. Yet the situation for Syrian refugees was very hard. Their work was restricted to agriculture, construction, and cleaning. There are a lack of job opportunities, there's discrimination and poverty. And all this pushed many educated young Syrians to think about alternatives. Some indulged in the idea they could work online from a computer or from a smartphone and make money outside of the restrictive regime that governs their condition of being forcibly displaced in Lebanon. At the same time, UN organizations, NGOs, and the private sector initiatives launched programs to train young refugees alongside host community youth in digital skills, for example, including coding schools, including basic digital literacy, in order to turn them into perhaps employees or digital online workers. Sitting in a cafe in the Beirut district of Burj Hamoud, a young Syrian woman we will call Haneen opens her laptop and points out an image annotation tool on her screen, which shows a satellite image of buildings that are surrounded by fields. She demonstrates how she would search for the names of the companies, try to annotate the buildings. What type of building is it? Is it a sale location, a warehouse, or another type of building? Those annotations are then saved in the data set to train machine learning algorithms on how to do this automatically in the future. A short training taught Haneen how to tell the difference between the various buildings, and the company she worked for basically uses these data sets and then sells them to their clients. In other projects, refugees in online image annotation, how it is called, worked with photographs of supermarket shelves to teach machines how to automatically refill them, for example. Or they annotated street images to classify pedestrians, objects, and animals for the development of the AI behind driverless cars. Such work is a human-powered task that trains artificial intelligence, thereby improving its vision and its expertise in classifying images. So we could say that currently some of the world's most economically marginalized people are involved in the cheap labor that trains advanced machine learning. And this has become a source of refugee livelihoods and indeed humanitarian relief. For a while, Haneen's family had access to only one laptop, which she was sharing with her brother, who also worked as an annotator alongside being an assistant in a tailor shop. Soon, Haneen's younger sister, who was 16, also got involved in this work. And even the younger ones, aged 10 and 9 years, started to contribute to the digital livelihood with a few clicks. With some of that money, they eventually bought a second laptop. And their digital labor, in a sense, was actually crucial for their economic survival. But it was not stable and it was not reliable. As the crisis worsened in Lebanon as well, they would often not get paid for months because the small enterprise they worked for was registered in the US and sometimes struggled to channel the money into Lebanon. By law as well, as I've said, Syrians are only allowed in Lebanon to work in 3 sectors of the economy. So all of this was a balancing act in a legal gray zone for a lot of the Syrians in Lebanon, Syrian refugees, to work self-employed, online, and remotely, as they thought, away from the watchful eyes of the authorities. Many other initiatives that train Syrians in digital skills for employment had to stop under the pressure of the government, shifting to a focus only on poor Lebanese citizens. And this included several UN-funded programs that started out using digital trainings for online work for refugees that were then put under pressure to stop doing this because it amounted or it equaled in the sense of the ministries to giving them skills to work in areas they're not allowed to work in. But precisely because refugees are often excluded from the formal labor market, this promise of the inclusive online economy resonates very strongly among them. The dilemma is that for those who need it most, accessing those digital livelihoods is also most difficult. Later on, as the Lebanese economy collapsed more and more, the value of the Lebanese currency plummeted, and the already low income of Haneen and her brother was worth less and less. Dollars became scarcer and scarcer. Workers at this image annotation company and at others started to complain, started to ask to be paid in US dollars. The idea is that, theoretically, working for clients abroad would bring in US dollars into Lebanon, which would actually benefit the economy and benefit them. But because of various reasons, all of this didn't quite work out. In a different social enterprise that also contracted refugees as image annotators, I talked to a self-employed Syrian online worker who was still in Syria. He was an IGP based in Azaz, who said, quote, "On a long project, it was huge, a lot of work. We maybe worked up to 15 hours a day, but at least 10 hours on average, and a minimum of 8 hours a day over a period of 2 months. The pay was little, maybe 1,400 Turkish lira, because it's the north of Syria, so the Turkish lira was widespread there, or around $200 for 2 months of work. That's very little, but unfortunately, there's no alternative. It's the work I have." And this "it's the work I have" is of course crucial, because for many of those who work online, this represents an alternative in a situation where there are very few local alternatives. Give me one second. So other displaced persons and refugees I talked to in the Middle East, Europe, and East Africa worked, for example, as online language trainers, as translators, or as freelancers in various fields through digital labor platforms. Many first encountered these opportunities provided by the digital platform economy through trainings provided by aid organizations or various programs in the tech sector. Hanin and her brother too took part in digital skills training at the American University of Beirut, which was funded by the World Food Programme. The pilot in 2016 was called Tech for Food. At the beginning, she thought they'll offer them work after they finished the training. She sort of anticipated to get employment afterwards, or at least some kind of income. But apart from a short trial in which they tried to give graduates a few short outsourcing jobs, this never quite happened. And this trial also failed for 2 reasons at least. Lebanon is a country that on many online labor platforms is blocked because of international sanctions against financial dealings with Syria and with parts of Lebanese political groups. And this also affects other countries. So each individual laptop would have to be whitelisted for them to do outsourcing work. And this sort of didn't quite work. The second reason was that the World Food Programme and the American University of Beirut both realized that if they do this kind of outsourcing through a platform, the pay would actually be very low, and they didn't want to support it. So in a sense, you could say it was an experiment with good intentions and good goals that was sort of limited by the current disempowering logics of the digital economy. The training was funded by WFP and initially included Lebanese youth and Syrians, but a follow-up survey of one cohort of about 542 graduates, as I also write in the report for those who've read it, found that only 13% actually worked after a year. And of course, among Syrians, this share is even much less. So many graduates of digital skills programs in a place like Lebanon that is highly restricted, therefore never get to apply their skills and enter the digital economy. But even when they do enter and find a job or they find a gig, they often remain marginalized and in precarity. So while I see many of these refugee-focused digital initiatives and enterprises as a positive social impact-driven initiative, they share many of the problematic characteristics with the general platform economy, such as self-employment instead of decent employment. On the other hand, they have very good intentions and they have the refugees' best interests at heart. So in my work as a consultant with the ILO and as a researcher, publishing a report as a non-consultant, as an academic, so I contributed and edited one report and published another one. So in this work, this double-edged nature of many initiatives in this field really triggered a difficult balancing act in the analysis. For, on the one hand, I wanted to highlight the social impact missions and good intentions of these smaller enterprises and other tech-led initiatives that support refugees and try to promote digital income opportunities. After all, these were not Amazon, Uber, or Fiverr. You know, they are often enterprises founded with a social mission. At the same time, as Umarani and other experts who authored the ILO's critical world employment and social outlook on the platform economy pointed out in their reviews of my work, these social impact actors are bound to the same rules and inadequate conditions as the digital economy at large. For example, they also take a large cut from the value that the workers generate, sometimes between 30 and 50%, to finance the business operations and to ensure the continuous functioning of the social enterprise. But this is actually, we could say, a commission, and it contravenes the ILO's convention on private employment agencies that stipulates that no commission should be charged if workers are matched with clients. So in terms of looking at digital livelihoods initiatives and their funding as a way to facilitate future prosperity, the dilemma is such that one can make use of these opportunities to provide income to those who need it, perhaps as a form of humanitarian relief. But as soon as refugees are included in the digital labor market, they're exposed to the same precarity and risks that characterizes the gig economy at large. Two questions I would like to pose today are therefore: the first, does the inclusion of refugees into digital labor practices offer a pathway to economic development and future prosperity? And secondly, how does the actual experience and impact of digital refugee work compare against the backdrop of its powerful promise of being inclusive and providing opportunity to everyone around the world? So I'll give you now a little bit of background, or at least some background thinking and background discussion. This seemingly inclusive and accessible characteristics of digital platform work have actually inspired this whole generation of social enterprises and international development initiatives that see it as a promising contribution to refugee livelihoods. The names of these actors and programs, networks, and initiatives sound, somewhat promising in themselves. Tech for Food, Techfugees, Jobs for Humanity, Level Up, Collective Freelancing Agency, etc. These initiatives include social enterprises, as mentioned, that connect refugee workers to jobs through digital platforms. They include skills training programs, coding boot camps, and they include online freelancing agencies, such as the Dadaab Collective Freelancing Agency for Refugees in Kenya. Beyond these initiatives, there is, of course, the global digital economy at large, the larger platforms that potentially anyone can tap into. And some countries, such as Egypt, have invested heavily into training thousands and if not tens of thousands of university graduates in online freelancing and ICT skills. They've actually integrated a module on online freelancing at the Information Technology Institute in all their programs. So many African countries as well have devised national strategies for a digital economy, often referring to the opportunity digital labor and e-commerce can provide for youth employment and for sort of leapfrogging towards prosperity, for jumping across certain developmental stages in an accelerated manner. The emergence of the digital global labor market has been discussed widely as a possible contributor to economic development in marginalized areas of the world through providing access to work opportunities and alternative sources of income. At the same time, workers in the global south and in crisis-affected countries are most affected by uneven internet connectivity, a lack of security, financial exclusion, and many other layers of exclusion and restricted access. And that's even more so true for refugees. So while this transformative potential of the digital economy is viewed to be the highest in the least developed regions, so to say, it is also at the global economy's margins that it appears least feasible. Despite a strong mobile money economy, for example, Kenya and Uganda, mobile money is really driving e-commerce, for example. But despite that, only about 24% of the Ugandan population actually uses the internet regularly. But nonetheless, its government sees ICTs as the key to transform Uganda from a lower income to a middle income country. But behind expectations that digital inclusion can trigger social and economic change stand a lot of powerful assumptions and ideas that are promoted by a variety of actors in the private sector, in politics, and in international development practice. One of these ideas is that the internet can benefit the world's poor, as Mark Graham writes, quote, by removing frictions, barriers, and intermediaries that stand between producers of goods and services in the global south and consumers of those things in the global north. At the same time, there is widespread techno-optimism, as Dragana Kaurin calls it in a paper for UNHCR. And this techno-optimism means that the internet, there's this idea that the internet would allow anyone, practically anywhere, to work online as long as they have the skills, a computer, and an internet connection. Problem is that the internet and its economic parts do not merely remove those frictions, but they also contribute to new divides and new forms of exclusion. And much of the recently published research on the digital economy and its role in international development actually highlights that very strongly. It's just the case of refugees is quite particular and very little has been written on that. Refugee status or its absence, for example, comes with a lack of bank accounts and financial access for a lot of people, which can be confounding at a time when electronic payments are gradually replacing the cash economies, the informal cash economies that refugees in certain places have depended on. Poor refugees living in camps might also struggle to afford data plans for mobile data. They might struggle to purchase hardware or to establish a safe place from which to work from. Many refugee camps feature weak infrastructure, and some countries even try to prohibit internet access for refugee populations more generally. So although digital economies undoubtedly have a connective quality that crosses boundaries, they have failed to fundamentally transform refugees' marginalized position as underpaid, informal workers with ambiguous legal statuses who struggle to make ends meet. Within this digital economy, refugees find themselves as exiles once again. And this is a kind of digital exile. Sorry, I'm just struggling with my notes here. Give me 1 second. So this condition of exile includes, as I mentioned before, certain sanctions. There are US-led global political sanctions against financial dealings with Syria, with parts of Lebanon, with other countries. And this, as one example of digital exile, has included many refugees from even setting up a profile on a platform, because platforms often based in the US or in places that comply with sanctions are actually forced to comply with these rules. And there are many other aspects that define such digital exile. Now, I'd like to give you a short sort of a visualized overview of the digital economy as it matters for refugees in this particular context. Some of the font on this will be a little bit small, but don't worry, I will go through it. I'm just particularly excited to I'll show you the whole thing later on, but this has just been designed by John Philip Sage, a designer and researcher in London I collaborated with. And this is page 3 of 4 pages that together make up an infographic on the digital refugee economy. But what I want to show you here is that alongside digital labor platforms that can be split into 2 kinds. You have online web-based platforms, such as Upwork or freelancing platforms. And then you have location-based platforms, such as Uber or delivery platforms. Both of these matter in different ways in the context of refugees. Of course, the benefit of online web-based platforms is that they promise to be accessible anywhere at any time, whereas location-based platforms often require you to be on site They're often concentrated in urban areas, and their security checks are also a bit more stringent, which makes it a bit less accessible for refugees. And then we have what I call the social impact platforms, which are some of those social enterprises that have a dedicated aim of supporting the livelihoods of refugees and migrants, for example, or impact-oriented outsourcing projects. And then another pillar on the side is, of course, the ICT-related employment in the labor market at large. And I won't have too much time, or I won't have any time to go into this, but we shouldn't forget that some of those digital skills trainings for refugees also provide transferable skills that can be applied seemingly anywhere. And even sectors such as agriculture and manufacturing are rapidly digitized in ways that provide potential work opportunities. The small text here that is probably not very easy to read is just a summary from an ILO report about the platform economy at large. I won't go into detail here, but it is probably worth noting that the number of platforms has grown exponentially, or at least has grown fivefold between 2010 and 2020. They generated revenues of at least 52 billion in 2019. And a lot of those revenues actually come from subscription fees and other fees that are charged to the worker. So whether you're a refugee or not, a citizen or any kind of digital worker, you're usually charged fees by the platforms. There are two quotes here that I included in this infographic because I think they tell us something, an interesting contrast. On the left, we have a refugee from Burundi who lives in Kampala, Uganda, saying, at the language services platform, Natakalam, I'm new. I don't have many students, but Natakalam helps me much because it came at a time when I was without a job at university. I lost my job because of COVID, so I didn't have a regular salary. And whatever you get, it helps. On the other hand, the quote on the right side by a Congolese female refugee in Kenya, who says, quote, I've tried to be online on freelancing platforms, Freelancer, Fiverr, and Upwork, but they did not get me any single money. The experience I got from there are a lot of professionals and you need to have a team. You need to build a very good background before you can start getting anything, any client. And actually they're very competitive. So on the one hand, there's this perception that the role of these platforms is very important at the time of economic crisis. On the other hand, the perception that it's actually very difficult to succeed in these competitive environments. This is just the bottom of this infographic, just briefly to highlight that e-commerce alongside online work is an important player in this field. And this includes various e-commerce initiatives, the potential, for example, for farmers in Uganda to sell their goods online or to buy cheaper products on digital markets or to trade with goods. And then we have the wider ecosystem that plays into the digital refugee economy, including ICT infrastructures, training programs, but also things such as the payment mechanisms on the internet. If you don't have access to payment mechanisms, you're excluded already from the digital platform economy. So I'll leave this here and just talk briefly about methods and the research. So the research is rooted in a 2-year project on digital refugee livelihoods, and methods included ethnographic research, field visits, and interviews among refugees in Lebanon and Germany, as well as migrants and host community members. And this was supported by 2 research assistants, Philip Rushworth in Berlin and Watfa Najdi in Beirut. A second phase of the project was conducted mostly remotely, and we did a lot of online interviews and online surveys as well, with some of these platforms, with the workers on some of these platforms. And there are 3 platforms that we focused on in particular at the beginning. This expanded later on and it became a global project, but the first of these I've already mentioned is Natakalam, which is Arabic for we speak. And it is registered in the US as a social enterprise, and it has actually matched around 200 displaced persons with over 10,000 clients in some 100 countries for language sessions. Humans in the Loop is another exciting social enterprise that is working in the field of image annotation. It sources work for the training of AI datasets. And it was launched in Sofia, Bulgaria, initially to source work for the local refugee population, and it then expanded into Turkey, Iraq, and Syria, and other places. They've provided income opportunities for about 460 workers through over 360 projects. So in a sense, these are all quite small. Takatam is the third one. Takatam is also an image annotation social enterprise that was mainly working through Lebanon with Lebanese citizens, but also Syrian refugees who worked in image annotation online. In addition to these platforms and our field visits and interviews, I conducted research for the ILO, comprising some 46 interviews with platforms, refugees, and host community youth for some of the reports I've shown you. And this research was also done together with Samuel Hall, East Africa. Right, so some of the general insights from the surveys we did with these three platforms might be interesting for you. So first, the refugees and also the host community citizens that work through these platforms are very highly educated, and this also mirrors to a certain extent the platform economy at large. Excuse me. At Matakalam, 95% had a background in higher education. At Humans in the Loop, we did interviews with 17 workers, and 14 of them had attended university. And also at Takatam, a large majority actually had a university degree or a college degree. For a lot of the platform workers, it was the only or the main source of income. Although none of the platforms and the enterprises actually intended this work to be their main source, but this was just how it was. And children and other family members also depended on them. So 63% of freelancers at Matakalam stated that between 2 or 4 family members depended on their income from this online work. Of course, there were a lot of perceived benefits of home-based online work among refugees. A 32-year-old Afghan woman based in Bulgaria said, quote, "I'm a single mother and I live here with my 2 kids. I'm the one who works. I don't have any family here. I prefer online work because my son needs constant care." A 20-year-old Syrian refugee in Turkey explained, quote, "I like online work more because it can happen from the house. I don't feel the tiredness so much as I do when I work outside the house in Istanbul." So we can also see how this digital work, while offering benefits, also reproduces long-standing patterns where taken for granted domestic work and care work are combined with precarious labor under the umbrella of flexibility. And these opportunities are sometimes circulated with the label of cultural fit, which explains how quite a few of these livelihoods programs actually have a focus on women working from home, sort of trying to think refugee women facing a restrictive labor market on top of caring responsibilities. And so it's intended to get them into work. Some of the major difficulties the people we talked to highlighted, I mean, there are so many, but some of them is the relatively low pay, but also the unpaid labor time. This applies specifically to those who work on freelancing platforms where you have to bid for jobs, you have to search for work, and then that is a lot of time that is not paid for. And especially at the beginning, you have to invest a lot of time until you have your first profile, until you get your first reviews. The absence of social protections was also highlighted because of self-employment, the commission that was charged by platform. There was also fatigue in high intensity work on image annotation, for example, where there's often a very quick turnaround for projects. Some online workers experienced isolation, and many felt that there was a lack of career progression. So the question is, once you're working in these fields, where do you go next? Since it is not really intended to be a permanent form of decent work. To give you some example of the payment levels that are involved here, so at Matakallam language services, at the time of the research, refugees got $10 an hour for remote conversation, and some also made additional income from remote lectures and translation work. Of course, the figures here really depend on how much and how many hours the individual people actually worked, but just to get an idea, about 35% earned less than $200 a month, 44% earned between $200 and $400, whereas 21% actually earned more, between $400 and $600 a month. In image annotation, one of the surveys we did among workers in Lebanon, so Lebanese and Syrian workers estimate that they made around $270 a month at an average of 35 hours of work per week. So a full-time month for $270. Notably, of course, these are very different kinds of work, image annotation and language training, but nevertheless, I thought these insights might be quite interesting to see what are the levels of payment and what are the main problems. Right, I would now like to go into the Berlin and Germany case study quite briefly, because it is somehow different from Lebanon, from Syria and other places that I've mentioned so far. So one can easily see here how different host countries and local contexts, as well as the different individual backgrounds and education levels, enable different forms of outcomes for digital livelihoods among refugees. The research we did among refugees in Berlin was collaborating with the sort of Ready School of Digital Integration. And they basically trained refugees and migrants and also some other populations that are in need of trainings in digital skills, basic skills, advanced skills, up to data science, and they were very active. They were a main actor, I would say, in the German tech sector, training and including more people into the tech sector through these trainings. So the rapid spread of those tech-enabled projects in Germany actually responded to the arrival of Syrian asylum seekers from 2015 and onwards. And this response saw the emergence of digital skills trainings and entrepreneurship programs, job matching platforms, and hackathons. The coding schools that emerged in the wake of the refugee crisis exemplify a broader trend, I would say, of finding technological answers to the challenges of integration. And Berlin was at the center of this development. Together with my research assistant, Philip Rushworth, I published an article in Ethnic and Migration Studies, which Henrietta also mentioned before. And there we write how on a Saturday morning in Berlin, in the Microsoft Atrium space, a new cohort came together of the Ready School's digital career program. One of the people there I talked to was Hisham from Syria. Before the war displaced him, he had worked as a lawyer in his home country, which is a highly prestigious profession. But Germany didn't accredit his degree in law, which is why he now hoped that learning how to code would give him an opportunity to sort of quickly establish a new professional expertise in Germany. Many of the other participants also had very high hopes, and these hopes were obviously not quite misplaced because at the time there was reports that there were 124,000 vacancies for IT specialists in Germany. And this abundance of opportunities was advertised among refugees and migrants and was also used by the coding schools to sort of justify why they're focusing on digital skills. Startups and the tech sector in general, just like the digital labor platforms, also promise to circumvent some of the local restrictions. They kind of also exist slightly outside of what is considered the national labor market. For example, a lot of the tech companies say that you don't need to learn German. It's enough to speak English, which is very suitable for certain migrants and refugees. And among coders, there was an idea that anyone can make it as long as you're passionate and work hard. And in the context of Germany, refugees have the right to work and face far fewer restrictions than, let's say, Syrians in Lebanon. The economy is strong and the market needs IT specialists. Very few, and this is part of the reason, right? Very few of the students therefore actually considered working on an online labor platform as a freelancer because they had a realistic prospect that they might find secure employment and decent work. So just briefly, a survey that we did together with the Ready School, you can see that, compared to the Lebanon example from before, here already 40% of alumni were actually working full time in one of the surveys. Among those with refugee status, that was a bit lower, 29% were working full time. And in general, of course, you can sort of ask the question, what kind of jobs were they doing? It does turn out the majority of graduates there did tech-related jobs, but also some of them were social workers, shop assistants, or delivery drivers. So it is not quite clear necessarily from this how to analyze the long-term perspective after doing the trainings. But what is clear is that to a certain extent, the refugee regime, the legal context, and the economy of the nation state in terms of, let's say, Germany compared with Lebanon, makes a massive difference as to how feasible actually is digital livelihoods as a form of economic development and contributing to prosperity. So although the digital economy often seems to be crossing boundaries and transcend national borders, the local actually matters much more than you would think in all of this. So in our conclusion of this case study in the article, we say that as those coding students begin to apply for jobs and evaluate their career option, they actually often realize, though, that this promised fast lane is not actually that fast. It is full with obstacles. This ostensibly inclusive, non-discriminatory, and diverse tech sector emerges as highly competitive. It also comes with its own demands for coders that are passionate, hardworking, and have a fitting culture. And here the demand for soft skills among employees often sort of is kind of fig leaf for we want people that fit into the working culture of the tech sector. And that often disadvantages certain refugees and migrants. So for many, the road to employment here is scattered as well with unpaid internships and short-term work. And migrants and refugees are particularly susceptible to this promise of the digital economy that it offers a fast lane to employment because their qualifications are not accredited and because they often face difficulties in learning the local language and integrating into the labor market. Especially for middle-class refugees who have not only lost a homeland, but also a professional identity and a class status, the accelerated social mobility that coding promises symbolizes a way out of being a refugee towards becoming a good, skilled immigrant. But this pathway to digital integration, we could call it, is tainted by this experience of contradiction. On the one hand, anyone can in theory succeed as a coder with hard work and passion. On the other hand, there are recurring experiences of discrimination, disadvantage, and all the difficulties that come with trying to become a coder as a refugee in Germany. So not only must migrants and refugees there prove their integrative efforts in official German integration courses, but they must also decode the specific characteristics of the international or ostensibly cosmopolitan tech sector, which is not that easy. So I think that migrants and refugees' experiences here in the digital economy of Germany show that this digital labor market, whether it is locally embodied in startups in the tech sector or it is transnational in terms of platforms, does not actually transcend the barriers and inequalities that define the marginal position of refugees within national labor markets. It offers a potential alternative, but it is far from sort of transcending those inequalities. Now, I'll just briefly return to the idea of prosperity, which, as Henrietta Moore writes, is not just wealth or growth in the economy. It's not just measured by GDP, but it is more about flourishing and the health of society with the guarantees of human capital development and with civil liberties. Such prosperity can't just be limited to measuring a technical assessment of the strength and weaknesses of development indicators, because it must involve a broader examination of the very kind of development and social progress we would like to promote. And it requires people to actively be involved in co-designing and co-producing their own futures. Now, based on this, within the world of work, we could say some of this is reflected in the notion of decent work. Perhaps among graduates of coding schools in Germany, one can speak of some contribution to long-term self-reliance and decent work, at least among those who succeed. But the internet economy or platform economy suffers from indecent conditions and an absence of social protections, and workers have no bargaining power to shape their futures. The specific situation of many refugees complicates this. They often lack a legal basis for having their workers' rights recognized in host countries, be it online or offline. Decent work principles may appear like a luxury for those who have no alternative as refugees in Lebanon, Kenya, Uganda, or elsewhere. I talked to one refugee in Uganda who was working through an on-demand platform for domestic work services. And he never heard of health insurance or sick leave before. All this means that some refugees are especially susceptible to the inclusive and collective promises of the digital economy. It also means a tendency for the digital platform economy to deepen the precarity that has long defined the economies of refugees throughout history. Also, if one looks at the business models of digital labor platforms, it quickly becomes clear that they do not have this sense of financing prosperity in mind at all. Perhaps the social enterprises I've talked about do, but the outcomes are not so different from the corporate platforms that classify workers as self-employed, charge their workers subscription fees and commission, and prioritize business growth, profit, and expansion over the well-being of the labor force. The same is not true for social enterprises that support refugees and try to contribute to their economic survival and their well-being. Nonetheless, for example, the charging of commission fees, the fact that social enterprises also do not employ the workers, but they hire them as self-employed workers, exemplifies that there is a structural problem here that undermines any possibility for all of this to contribute to this sense of future prosperity, unless, and we'll come to that later, certain steps are taken. So we can look at the inclusion of refugees in the digital platform economy as one particular market-driven development approach that aims at livelihood generation, upskilling, and perhaps even economic self-reliance, rather than a local market, which often fails refugees because of local restrictions to their labor rights. The focus here is on a transnational labor market. But as long as the rules of this largely unregulated labor market sort of remain as they are, furthering more and more inclusion of vulnerable refugees into this economy leads to outcomes of precarious labor with indecent working conditions. It will not lead to prosperity in the sense of like this institute understands it. I will now go over some of the main aspects that define sort of the life circle here. You can see the structure of this large infographic, which of course you can't read because it's too small here, but there are 4 different elements. We've already looked at the third one. Part 1 talks about what I think are the preconditions and enablers of a sustainable inclusion of refugees in the digital economy. The second one talks about 6 layers of exclusion. of refugees in the digital economy. And then the fourth one will talk about a certain checklist for fair work, what questions need to be asked and answered in order to talk about fair work in the digital economy for refugees. I've tried to make them as large as possible for you to be able to read it. It might be a little bit small, but I hope that you can see more or less what this is about. So if we talk about preconditions and enablers, we have rights and norms. Refugees' right to work, their freedom to conduct a business, and their financial inclusion and access to banking are all foundational pillars for digital livelihoods to become a driver for prosperity and actually sustainable development. Infrastructure and hardware is an ongoing problem. The internet connectivity and the electricity supply in many camps is not given. And even access to a computer or a smartphone is often a problem. As you can see here in the quotes, a Somali refugee in the Dadaab camp in Kenya said, quote, "There is no internet and no power when I need it. At night, which is when the freelancers normally apply for jobs in the United States, in the West, there is no electricity here. So if you don't have a laptop and data bundles and internet, you have all these kinds of problems." So here we also see the time difference between Kenya and the US is such that refugees living in certain camps actually have no access to the internet at the time when they need it to apply for these gigs. The bottom of the same page here talks about the skill training element as a foundational, contributing factor, or we could call an enabler of the inclusion of refugees into the digital economy. But crucially, this also includes a lot of stuff that happens after the trainings, such as mentorship, ongoing mentorship, and the establishment of networks and professional networks, and soft skills. Although soft skills are used as fig leaf in certain areas for excluding refugees, at the same time, trainings need to include certain ideas about the actual job aspirations that individuals have. Payment mechanisms and digital identity are a crucial factor. And this is the reason why many initiatives and projects actually fail. There is a need for a universally accepted digital identity for refugees, a form of identity that is also accepted by labor platforms as a way to verify their identity. At the moment, this is not the case. There needs to be more access to payment mechanisms outside of traditional banking, from which many refugees are excluded, and continuing expansion of mobile money infrastructure. Of course, the contradictions here are that all of this I'll come back to the fair work principles later on. The problem here in accessing the digital economy for a lot of refugees are many different layers of exclusion. There are only 6 layers here that I mention, and this is once again the lack of digital literacy or the lack of skills to navigate the online marketplace and the internet economy. There are, as already mentioned, connectivity-related layers of exclusion, such as a lack of electricity, a lack of internet access, but also difficulties to set up a secure workspace. But then you also have wider financial and economic problems, such as the bank account problem, but also the subscription fees that are charged by labor platforms that really burden and actually put refugees and other workers at risk who need to invest sometimes weeks of unpaid labor time in order to get returns and also pay subscription fees. And the laws and regulations need to be tackled. Those international sanctions that continue to exclude certain nationalities and many refugees from even accessing the digital economy. So something needs to be done about this, I think. And then you also have a social and cultural element of exclusion that includes experiences of discrimination in the platform economy for refugees. For example, a Sudanese refugee here living in Kakuma, Kenya said, quote, "It is not always easy to get a job on Upwork, especially if you introduce yourself to an employer telling him that I am so-and-so and currently living in a refugee camp. So this is when an employer learns that you're a refugee and they start doubting you. And they might not actually believe that you might be the kind of person who can deliver because they know how life in the camp is." So what kind of fair work are we talking about? What do I mean here? And I think there are a lot of points, but I'll just briefly highlight a few. For example, one question in terms of accessibility is, are there any restrictions for certain nationalities to join a platform? Does the vetting process that is used by the platform to onboard new workers pose any specific barriers? But then we also need to ask what pre-existing skills, including language skills, are actually needed for working or trading on a particular platform. But crucially, working conditions just need to be improved. And this is a wider struggle for justice in the platform economy that is not specific to refugees. Has the platform committed itself to any fair work principles? Is the average pay at least on the level of the local living wage? Is there a provision of insurance, of social protections? In almost all cases, there is not, because digital work is misclassified as self-employment. There are other aspects, such as the level of competition, that is very important. Competition is very fierce in the digital economy. There are the problems of fees that are charged and commissions, and questions about sustainability and progression and the level of support that individuals are offered in order to succeed if they come from marginalized backgrounds. At the bottom here, there are a few other aspects that are worth mentioning, but I will just sort of highlight perhaps here. In terms of the level of support, one of the problems is the lack of bargaining power. And the question is as well, is there any mechanism for workers on digital platforms to complain, to bargain for better conditions, and so on? And some of this sort of tries to expand what the Fair Work Foundation has already been doing on the platform economy at large for the particular perspective of refugees. So I'll just conclude now, as I also see I'm almost already over time. So I'll quickly conclude by saying that, just coming back to the questions I asked, and by saying that we can see that those unprecedented investments are being made in the world of work that are seeking to transform refugee livelihoods in the digital economy. This includes the private sector, all these initiatives we've talked about, international development organizations, and so on. So there's a global push to finance a transition towards prosperity among refugees through existing digital labor markets and e-commerce. But the struggle for digital economic inclusion will not lead to any deeper sense of future prosperity unless some of the key foundational problems of the digital economy are addressed and access for refugees is improved. And this, to come back to some of the key principles that I have established in my work, including there needs to be a wider struggle for justice among refugees, for their right to work, for financial access, at the same time as there needs to be a struggle for justice and equality within the platform economy at large. So the continuities of exile in terms of the digital economy are that they mirror long-standing patterns of precarious and unprotected work among the forcibly displaced. This includes informality, this includes precarity, but some of the changes are the promises of the internet economy to circumvent the local market, to exist as if it was transcending the borders of the national context, which I think I have shown to not be true. New forms of digital exiles are then defined by a contradiction in a sense between hypermobile digital opportunity on the one hand and layers of digital exclusion and confinement on the other hand. And these contradictions need to be resolved in order for digital livelihoods for refugees to lead to future prosperity. This is it. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to discussion.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and fantastic work, really wonderful comparative work, which is really important as well. And I very much enjoyed that. I wonder if we could start by just thinking about a few things that might be on the minds of some of the people listening today. So we talked a little bit, or you talked a little bit about the relationship between, say, global labor markets and national labor markets. And I'm thinking, so some of the things you describe are very different kinds of work, although they all go on a digital platform. So, you know, there's a great big difference between, you know, training AI to language training, which at least has a sort of personal interaction involved in it. There are other kinds of work. Coding is another different kind of work. So when we see the precarity of digital employment, I mean, is that something that is just a feature of the digital, or is it something that's actually happening already in labour markets elsewhere, and the digital, in a sense, is piggybacking on that? How do you see that yourself?
Yeah, I think in some way there is the conditions of the local regime enforce the conditions within the digital platform as well. For example, that one of the reasons of self-employment is the legal issues, the difficulty of hiring someone as a full employee who doesn't have a bank account and lives in a faraway country. And of course, the sort of online freelancing is an easy solution in the sense that it allows those social enterprises to quite easily onboard new workers and pay them money as they go, so to say. But it is also reinforced by the wider digital economy in ways that go beyond what is happening in local labor markets, I think. And one of the problems is as well, you know, the algorithmic management, if you talk about larger platforms and how inequalities are written into the business models of these platforms. And the misclassification of workers as self-employed is something that is perhaps also existing in local economies, but it is extremely reinforced by digital platforms to an extent that it is at the same time more problematic, but also more relevant for refugees, because self-employment seems safer for them as a legal alternative to employment in places where they are not allowed to be employed locally. So ironically, the exploitative elements are at the same time there's what inspires the interest in it.
Yes, but there's a strange kind of sort of merging in a way of the humanitarian effort here and a certain kind of business effort. So you take a country like Kenya, for example, you have a situation already where much of the development agenda that's directed towards that country, particularly social enterprises, are trying to reach what they call the last mile. So they're trying to get services and so on into the very poorest populations. And the argument behind that is that everybody is going to get out of poverty by becoming self-employed, by becoming an entrepreneur, that's the way through. And in fact, humanitarian organizations now basically speak of people moving through stages of vulnerability to new forms of entrepreneurship as a way of sort of solidifying employment opportunity. But actually, there's a strange kind of mechanism here between these platforms that think they're doing good and others who are actually doing something else, but they do end up making everybody vulnerable under this heading of self-employment, because of course it's cheaper.
Yeah, and I think the sort of the rise of the entrepreneurship model in building self-reliance, etc., that is going on and has been going on for a while is somewhat sort of overlapping with what we see here. Although reaching the last mile in this case has been a major challenge because of the various connectivity problems and so on. But
no, understood. So when you've been doing this work for the ILO, so what does the ILO plan to do about regulating any of this, if anything? I mean, what has been the impact of your work within the ILO itself and the discussions that they have about this form of labor?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really talk on behalf of the ILO, but I can say that I do hope, and I do also know that this is taken forward, that there are new projects being made, and that clearly the ILO's mandate as the organization that is also tasked with, working towards the protection of workers, that their place in this whole conversation is going to be around decent work, protections, to an extent that it is not in the same way represented as such by the World Food Programme, for example, or UNDP.
Yeah.
Which I think at the same time, that also means that the whole push towards experiments. And I think in the digital space, when it comes to digital technology and innovation in development and humanitarianism, there's a lot of experimenting going on. And some of the things I talked about are very early day pilots and experiments. So I think as we go in the near future, the hope is, and my expectation is, that, and this is something we already see in the digital economy at large, in platforms, that increasingly national legislation is trying to regulate different platforms. And I think we will see a similar push in the space of development and humanitarianism, where protection and decent work principles are put first, and experimentation, hopefully, is something that we can learn from, but something that we no longer will have to do without building programs in a way that they lead to decent work outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, it seems it's. I can see that starting from fair work is a good opportunity there, but it does seem at the moment that that phrase "exiled within the digital economy" is the experience that many people are having, and that there's an intersection here between many pre-existing forms of exclusion and the way in which the digital economy actually allows that exclusion to be operationalized.
Yeah.
The operationalization of exclusion. So it's a kind of fine-grained, awful version of exclusion functioning most effectively.
And I mean, as we talked about financing prosperity, right? The financial aspect here is one of the most crucial ones.
Yeah.
The fact that there have been official directives for banks in Lebanon not to allow Syrians to open bank accounts, for example, and all the various regulations that make it difficult for mobile money to actually expand in the Middle East, and things like that. The actual financial exclusion, that in the platform economy, everything is about digital transactions. So if you're excluded from that space, you're truly exiled in all the ways.
Yeah. Yeah, very, very, very powerful. Very, very powerful. Well, that's a good moment to segue into the audience questions, because there's a link here to a question which is being asked by my colleague Nikolai Menchev, who is working in Lebanon. And he's asking, are there ways to create a digital economy, or to create digital economy jobs that involve both hosts and refugees in ways that strengthen a sense of belonging and solidarity between hosts and refugees in Lebanon or elsewhere?
My sense is this happens a lot through the training programs and the digital skills training at the American University of Beirut, for example. That's the one that was funded by the World Food Programme, and I think still is, I'm not entirely sure. So they initially didn't really think of the trainings as a way of reconciliation, togetherness, and social cohesion, but along the way, they did establish a much stronger focus on the kinds of communities that are created through the learning process. And I think that between Syrians and Lebanese, but that also applies to different contexts of conflict and inequalities. But I think in terms of the work itself, I've read at least some promising case studies where workers' cooperatives actually managed to provide some of the cushion of social protection and decent work that was non-existent in the platform economy, simply by becoming an intermediary that employs workers in a way that gives them the social protections, but that brings people closer together and makes them, gives them more decent conditions. But I think the key problem is still that the digital economy itself needs to transform the atomization of the individual worker is constantly pushing down on all the initiatives. So there is a need to push back as much as possible.
Yeah, that's right. So we are running a fully hybrid seminar this afternoon, and so we have various people in various places who are both present and hybrid. So we're going to open up now to some of the IGP students who are with Matt Davis, who are actually all together in one space. Matt, can you link us into everybody who has the question there, please? No, yes.
Sorry, I was muted. Can you hear me, Henrietta?
Yes, can we see you? Let's see if we can see you. Yes, you're there. Good, perfect. Yeah.
You should also be able to see Flavia, who's going to ask the question.
Yeah, I can. Yes, welcome.
Hand over to Flavia. Flavia, thank you very much.
Yeah, hello. My name is Flavia. My question is specifically about Uganda. Obviously, that is my country of origin, but there's statistics and kind of figures you gave about, which to my understanding, you say 24%, there's 24% usage, internet usage in Uganda. I personally think it is a whole lot less than that due to certain factors. I don't know whether any of you are aware, but about 5 years ago, the government imposed tax, like they call it OTT tax, but in the government's kind of view, it was gossip tax. They were basically trying to stop the internet use because they believe people were actually gossiping. So it's in that reason, for that reason, the benefit of people benefiting from using digital economy is eroded by the fact that the government imposes that tax. Fortunately, the whole thing completely collapsed. So the government found itself in a position where people kind of found a way of going around and using VPN. So they abolished the OTT tax, the gossip tax, but again, it has now imposed 30% access to internet. So for that reason, I think while the idea is very good, for people within the country, whether they're in refugee camps or within the country as a whole, government policies sometimes erode the benefit from what it is. The other thing that I also wanted to mention is that obviously the access to electricity. I think you mentioned that Uganda as a country, the access to electricity, the percentage is very, very low, and it's mainly restricted to towns. And he mentioned farmers selling their produce using the internet. I think that is highly unlikely, because we are talking about people who actually don't have access to internet. If only 15 to 20% have access to internet, how do you expect a farmer in the village, deep in the village, be able to sell their produce to the internet, to the international world? And the idea is very good, because obviously Uganda produces 100% organic food, and there is potential. But you have to look into all these things for
Flavia, how do you think? Can we ask Andreas perhaps how he might address some of those challenges?
Yeah. Okay. How do you? Such challenges may be addressed. Also, the fact that the government has banned other social media channels like Facebook. So, how do you think those can be addressed?
Thank you, Flavia.
And also, there's also issue about corruption.
All right, enough, Flavia, because Andreas can't hold all this in his head, I think, probably. Thank you for your question. Yeah, absolutely. So, Andreas, your reflections on Uganda from your perspective.
I mean, I think it was a very important intervention and comment. So thank you very much for this. And I mean, as far as I understand it, what I take out from the question and the comment is that that's exactly what I wanted to say, basically. I highlighted the statistics, which I think are from the ITU, but who knows? The numbers might even be lower, of internet users and people who have internet access. And I think some of these challenges are trying, some initiatives try to address it by designing their programs as low tech as possible. Of course, this is no longer really the digital economy, but there are some agricultural platforms or initiatives, for example, that run on an SMS basis, that are about keeping track of expenses and sales, or kind of like forestalling budget, and they work on an SMS registered basis through like low tech telephones. But of course, correctly, that is no longer the digital economy, and I think the question is really, how feasible is this? Which is exactly why I pointed out the contradiction between the low internet access and the fact that a lot of governments are now investing high hopes into ICT transformation as a key force in development when the infrastructural challenges are so extreme. And that's not even talking about digital literacy, right? That's a whole different conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's sort of, I think Fabio's point goes back partly to the initial question I began with in one way, which is that farmers selling produce on the market using digital connection, if they have it, is not the same kind of digital connection as the digital platform that you're talking, or some of the digital platforms you're talking about. So it's, although exploitation exists in both, I'm pretty sure, but interesting. And it links to something that your next questioner would like to ask you. So Yuan He is saying that in some poorer parts of China, young laborers are also recruited as coders, mainly doing data annotation for facial recognition and voice recognition and so on. And so there may even be up to 1 million of these part-time workers. And the question is, you mentioned in your talk that the refugee status make people more susceptible to such jobs. I wonder to what extent the phenomenon is unique to the refugee population, or is it an industrial expansion that absorbs the laborers who were previously excluded from the old economic systems?
Yeah, thank you. It is, of course, not unique to refugees at all. So thank you for this example as well. I think there are certain things that are specific about the position of refugees in relation to the digital economy. And one of these might be the political sanctions for certain nationalities in countries that then also happen to be conflict-affected countries or that produce refugees. Other aspects might be the forced displacement and the experience of leaving many things behind, of being in a new country that does perhaps not speak the language, where you do not have a network, and you have lost not only a lot of property, maybe family members, but you also lost the class identity, you lost your professional identity, and then your qualifications are not even accredited. So I think the forced migration experience in itself creates something of a difficulty to include oneself in the labor market quickly, easily, that makes the promise of online work so seemingly inviting and useful. But I do agree that poverty or that a lack of local opportunities in general is of course also a big drawing factor. When I look at poor provinces in China, and if there are estimations that there were 100,000 full-time and 1 million part-time workers, and the numbers are growing, this is a phenomenon that is happening all over the world. And I think a growing share of workers on digital platforms are located in areas that are perhaps in the global south, or in general don't have strong local economies. So there you go.
Yes, yeah. It is a trend, isn't it? So now Chris Hackl, who's on the panel, would like to ask a couple of questions about data, but he can do it himself. Chris.
Thank you very much, Henrietta. Thank you, Andreas, for a wonderful presentation, really fascinating. I wanted to ask a couple of questions that are linked by this interest in data. So the first is that we know from some great academic work that platform capitalism is making money both through rent-seeking behaviour, like the kind of commissioned fees model that you described, but it's also operating at a sort of second level, which is selling data or harvesting lots of data and then selling it. So I was wondering, is this playing out, this sort of sale of data model, in any of the kind of smaller platform social enterprises that you've been working with? And obviously for refugees, there are great concerns about data, and this sort of leads into my second question, which is about other kinds of digital finance. So did you see in your research any connections with these other kinds of emerging digital finance? And to be specific, what I'm thinking of is this great enthusiasm for cash transfers, particularly post-COVID. So we've seen pre-COVID, the World Food Programme doing these experiments with cash transfers, and particularly these kind of basic credit cards or basic debit cards, so that instead of providing food, refugees are simply just given money, and so they've got the kind of, in theory, the power to buy whatever they want. And then during COVID, because of the kind of massive increase in volume of cash transfers across many countries, and not just to refugees, there seems to be real increased enthusiasm. So I was noting the UNDP are sort of thinking about this too. Yeah, so just to summarize, platform finance and data, and intersections between other kinds of digital finance and the livelihoods that you discussed.
Yeah, the data part is of course very important, and just not so long ago there was the problem of UNHCR data on refugees being passed on to the Myanmar government, and then sort of by extension providing biometric data to the country that violently expels the people. And there are very important questions of risk when it comes to data management in the context of forced displacement more generally. So I think it's a really important question. I don't know, and I also do not hope, that any of the social enterprises I've worked with are in any way interested in selling their data, but I do hope they protect it well. Of course, some questions that I've asked myself but haven't really found answers to concern this idea that exists that the authorities won't be able to see whether or not someone who is not allowed to work is a freelancer online, right? And that also extends to questions of how do you get the money in, and mobile money infrastructures or not. And I mean, really complicated stories of even Lebanese citizens, but also Syrian refugees who couldn't, for various reasons, get a bank account or get set up on a platform, and then open this account somewhere in Russia with like a mobile money firm, and they had to travel to the embassy in another country to show their passport to like register a business, or there's stuff like Estonian e-citizenship for businesses and things like that. All of this seems like really inspiring for people who are excluded from many of the benefits that the privileged part of the world enjoys every day. And also again creates data questions about selling data, but I think it is a question that, the larger the scale, the more problematic it gets. And some of the initiatives I work with are quite small scale, intentionally as well. And cash transfers for me are just part of the origin story of digital livelihoods, really. And in a sense that you think about the market-driven approach to facilitating economic development or employment outcomes or livelihoods. Just cash transfers focus on the local market traditionally, and digital livelihoods would basically directly tap into a transnational market to get cash locally, which can then again be used in the local market theoretically. So I think there are a lot of connections, and how cash transfers are transforming in the digital age, I'm not entirely sure, because I'm just not up to date on the humanitarian technologies that are used that are different from cash transfers, and chargeable cards the World Food Programme used. But I'm sure mobile money, for example, is just one of the really important drivers. I mean, a mobile money account is so much more accessible than a bank account in a lot of places. And if all the businesses and service providers accept mobile money, then you can quite easily charge your digital wallets with money through, let's say, working on a platform, and then again use the digital money to pay for your electricity, for example. And you don't need a bank anywhere in between, like a traditional bank, theoretically.
Thank you.
That's true. That's true. Although I'm sure the humanitarian services are now off onto Bitcoin, aren't they? But anyway, this is another whole story. But coming back to that question of digital livelihoods, I think that Sylvia Velasco, who's on the panel and who is an alumna of the IGP, wants to ask you a question herself. Sylvia, can you come online, please?
Thank you, Henrietta, and thank you so much, Andreas. This has been an amazing talk. And my questions are basically related to policy, because you have shared a lot of great information, and I was wondering if you can share regarding the international aid and all these, like it seems they are doing a lot of, like they have good intentions, but the outcomes are not necessarily good. So, and just in the same case of social enterprises and NGOs. So I was wondering, what will be your suggestions in terms of policy to address a more effective, even when this might be on a long term, a more effective inclusion practice for decent job? And the second one is regarding the work with government, which usually used to be very, very hard. Some problems and the baseline of all of this, for example, infrastructure, connectivity, you might know this is a challenge because it's not necessarily in our hands. It's more on the government decisions, legislation. So for that question will be, what are your experiences influencing government to address this type of problems, or what will be your suggestions? I am speaking also on behalf of, I am from Mexico, and one of the main problems we faced for digital inclusion on the overall, whether it's finance or on the economy and education, is due to the lack of infrastructure, especially for the forest area. So I was wondering, how can you make that linked for recommendations, policy recommendations, so we can at least set a baseline for all people to have access to this digital economy? Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sylvia. Andreas.
Thank you, Sylvia. Yeah, well, probably some of the most important questions I can think of, but also the most difficult in a way. But I think, so in terms of policies, what I really enjoyed in the process of doing research with the ILO and then producing this report is that then the research you produce hopefully leads to evidence-based programs that are then delivering policy, right? So that's the ideal. And I think the reason why there were so many experiments at the beginning was simply that no one actually measured the outcomes, because they weren't there yet, because it was kind of this new field of humanitarian experimentation. And now, slowly there's a lot of impact assessments of different programs. There are some shifts going on from one country to another. But I think in general, the policies that are important to advocate for are that protection must, the avoidance of precarity and risk must come first, and not only be addressed after it is already a reality. And how to manage this, there are many answers for that, but I think innovating smaller policy solutions is actually one of the big challenges here, because until the platform economy is transformed into a paradise of decent work, I mean, time will pass. So until then, I think it is very important to think on a smaller scale. For example, how can insurance be provided for those who do freely choose to work as self-employed freelancers in the platform economy? Could there be any kind of workers cooperative that can be formed that would then sort of increase the bargaining power? Or the idea of freelancing agencies that act as intermediaries between platforms and workers, and perhaps create another layer of support and so on. So kind of trying to identify these small pockets where change is possible and channeling some of the funds in that direction, I think would be a good start. But of course, the problematic dilemma here is that you don't want to sort of work around the problem and thereby ensure its ongoing existence, because if you make it absolutely feasible and okay for people to work on platforms because you kind of bring in money from elsewhere to pay for insurance and all that, then the platform economy will never restructure, because why should they if everyone else pays for those additional kinds of support? So sorry, I think there was a slight digression from your question, but I think I'd probably avoid answering the question about what policies I would sort of particularly recommend, but I hope that was somehow useful from my thinking. And as for the second question, I do not have a lot of experience in advocating policies or working directly with government on this issue at all. But my sense is that there is sort of a shared interest, for example, in ensuring, let's say, the verification of refugees' identity on platforms, right? This is one particular issue where when I talked to Upwork, some people there said they would be happy to verify refugees' identities if the government would help them to create some kind of identity that they could verify. But then you could critically point out that the problem is that Upwork won't accept the alien ID cards that they already have. But then the government is too slow in renewing those ID cards, which again creates problems in Kenya, for example, to actually stay on the platform. So these smaller issues, again, I would say small issues are a good start to work with governments, and then the larger issues will probably come in. But I think there are a lot of small problems that could be tackled quite easily, and perhaps they would provide a stepping stone for addressing some of the larger issues down the road.
Great, thank you very much. So we're going to go to a question from Shemwell Yerushalmi and then back to the IGP students. So from Shemwell, I want to ask you, what is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the digital economy and employment opportunities of Syrian and other refugees? And if the pandemic is creating or has created any new opportunities of employment for refugees?
Yeah, I mean, on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the platform economy at large, I would recommend some articles that recently came out. I think there was also a special issue in a journal. I don't know if it was the International Labour Review, I think so. Also, Uma Rani was involved there, and some people at the Oxford Internet Institute have also published work on that. So in general, then the answers are there, but specifically for refugees, the only thing that I understood through my research is that it was actually a very important safety net for those that already worked online at the time the pandemic struck. So some of the language trainers that were working with Natakalam, they could continue their work. At the same time, suddenly a lot of professionals and students in North America or Europe had so much free time to spare. So the demand for online language learning somehow actually grew during the pandemic. And I think that might be true for certain other sectors. I mean, we know that when you talk about location-based platforms in delivery or taxi services, so delivery completely exploded, increased exponentially, whereas taxi services suffered at the beginning. So some of the platforms shifted. But one of the key problems, I think, during COVID was the lack of protection for workers, the lack of health and safety concerns on the side of the platforms that did result, if you sort of combine all the risks that are already there, and then you add the health risk, it really meant that platforms put their workers at risk and didn't protect them well enough against the risks of COVID, I think, in many cases. So that's what I know. But among some of the refugees I talked to, the demand for the online work actually increased. At the same time, and this is the last thing I say in this question, sorry, Henrietta, I'm just going.
No, go ahead. I'm just looking at the students, go ahead.
There was a great initiative by Refunite, it was called Level Up, and they were also doing image annotation work, and they were sourcing it in East Africa to local population and refugees that they did online work. So they had great partners, big corporate partners, but because of COVID, those partners pulled out and they basically didn't operate during the whole pandemic, which actually meant that hundreds of potential workers lost their livelihood opportunity. So I think that probably happened in a lot of other places too.
Yeah, it's grim, very grim. Now we're going back to the IGP students. Matt, are you online there?
Yes, we are, Henrietta. And we have Natalia, who would like to ask a question.
Great, Natalia, please.
Hi, sorry. It was more of a curiosity question, so really quick. How do you see the global energy crisis, especially considering the recent loss of power in Lebanon, impacting digital inclusion and exclusion for refugees? And, you know, especially also considering how it was mentioned before, entrepreneur activities is a way forward to enhance prosperity. Thank you.
So digital energy, so the global energy crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Lebanon, the problem of electricity and energy was already there years back, and the need for generators to constantly fill the holes because the electricity system just didn't support everything. So that was already there, but of course now it is much worse. And to the point that, I mean, if you don't have a generator and if you don't have fuel to power that generator, then if the electricity goes off, I mean, you can't go online unless you pre-charge power banks and then use those to, I'm sure people innovate, but to me, it really shows the limitations of the idea that the digital economy can function as a universal solution for livelihoods in the context of economic and humanitarian crisis. Simply because the vulnerability of us and people around the world, and particularly in places like Lebanon, their actual dependence on things that were taken for granted are exposed. And at the same time, the digital economy and the internet itself, I mean, is also dependent on all of these very basic resources. So I think it's a very important question. Thank you.
And I think probably the last, maybe perhaps the last question, unless somebody sticks their hand up very quickly, is coming from Hannah Baumann. And I think Hannah's online actually somewhere. Hannah, are you online? Can you ask yourself?
I am.
Ah, brilliant. Hello.
Thanks a lot, Andreas. It was really interesting. I liked how you deconstructed this promise of the digital to take us kind of beyond the state borders that form the biggest conundrum and often obstacle for refugees. And I was thinking of initially, before listening to your talk, the way that the internet could overcome both sort of the hypermobile situation of people who are catapulted into places where they don't have the permission to work, but also people who are immobilized, who are stuck. You've worked on Palestine as well, for example, in the Gaza Strip. It's often talked about that people who can't move can at least access these global labor markets, or people who are stuck in refugee camps. And so I was really impressed by the way you showed that actually the local is still really relevant. But at the same time, it seems to me that a lot of the organizations or businesses you worked with do sort of manage to circumvent local labor market regulations, right? Otherwise, they couldn't employ people who don't have a permission to work in whatever country they're sitting in. So I was interested in finding out a bit more about the minutiae of that. How does that work? Do they make use of loopholes or of sort of incongruencies between different national labor markets? And then perhaps, leading on from that, what does that mean about, regulating decent work on an international scale? And perhaps that links to our colleague Conrad's question, who talks about, who posed the question about an international minimum wage. Would that be sort of a way around that question of companies always finding niches elsewhere? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it basically means putting on sunglasses and putting a lot of cash in your suitcase and trying to, enter the country through the airport in some situations. Not that bad, but to get money into Lebanon, for example, to refugees working for a platform. I have heard that required the people running the platform to actually bring in cash physically, because there was just no way to channel the money in a way that could then be distributed to individuals in a safe way. Of course, one problem was losing the money. So it was not about illegality necessarily, but about the kind of absence of suitable and direct channels that are created in crisis context. And in Lebanon, I think that has also been a problem for like NGOs and development work in general. The sanctions against financial dealings with Syria and different parts of sort of the Lebanese political elites kind of created a situation where it's really very difficult to operate there. And some of the other approaches of making it work is to try and reduce the regularity of the payments. Instead of every month, to do it every 3 months, which created problems for the workers themselves. Of course, it could also, if there was a stronger mobile money infrastructure, that would be a bit easier to just kind of load money onto mobile wallets, which could then be cashed out. But in Lebanon, that just didn't really work. So essentially, if you're a US registered enterprise, you kind of need to find someone in Lebanon so you can open an account there. And even then, I think it is quite difficult. I'm not an expert in this. But yeah, I mean, one example that is interesting was that the cut down from the Lebanese ministry on the digital skill trainings actually it wasn't a coincidence, but I was told that there was a presentation, that they were talking about the work they did, then someone, I don't want to name different, but it's a UN-funded training program in digital skills. And then someone was in the audience of the presentation who happened to be in the ministry, and then they said, no, you can't do this anymore because you're basically training refugees to work in professions they're not allowed to work in. And then they actually issued a written statement, and that was the end of the show, basically. But unofficially, some of this still continues. So I think there are a lot of other more formal workarounds that I could talk about, but I think perhaps to keep it short, I just say that there are a lot of ways of dealing with the fact that it might be illegal, or at least a legal gray zone, for some of the refugees to be employed through these platforms. But because it is self-employment and because it is online, the perception is still that it is kind of invisible to the authorities. But to come then to your second question, the problem is that this prevents many of these initiatives to scale. I mean, if you operate in that way, you can't scale to a regional organization that employs thousands of refugees. So I think the huge global platforms often don't work in these places, such as Lebanon, because of all the restrictions. But then if you do something that avoids those restrictions and works around it, you can't scale, or it is at least very difficult to scale. But the different enterprises are very creative, and they have innovative workarounds. They also work with lawyers to make sure it's not illegal. So it's not like there's a lot of illegal activity, but I would say that there's an active exploitation of the legal gray zone in that sense. So kind of negotiating decent work on a global scale from that point, I think is difficult if you talk about social enterprises on the one hand and the larger platform economy at large. I think one of the problems with decent work in the platform economy from the perspective of refugees is that there's a different starting point in places where they don't even have the right to work. So there is one problem. Let's say a citizen who has the full right to work is exploited and faces indecent working conditions on the platform. There needs to be a struggle for decent work, but then there are refugees who are not even legally allowed to work, that don't even have access to basic workers' rights. So the struggle actually needs to start in granting refugees the right to work before it can be about decent work in the platform economy.
Yeah, I think that's right. Now, we are out of time, but Natalie Garland, who is one of our PhD students who works in Lebanon, has just put her hand up. So I'm going to let her come online and quickly ask you a short question. Natalie, please.
Yes. Hi, thank you so much for that presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'll be quick with my question, but considering your background as a social anthropologist, I'm interested to hear your insights on the psychosocial impact of being a qualified, educated, skilled, unemployed refugee job seeker. Because donors and NGOs, they always like to discuss the success stories, but we rarely ever hear about the experience of the approximate like 90%, if you will, refugees who remain unemployed, especially in the Lebanon context, because of the political economic dynamics. but who began these trainings with these high hopes of employment, which you sort of touched on in your presentation, when they started their training, which is oftentimes competitive to even enter in the first place. So I'm just curious about what your experience with this false hope phenomenon, or this is kind of what I have come to refer to it as, and how do you think this will affect refugees' mental well-being in the long term? So I guess this is more directed at the situation in Lebanon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the experience is that a lot of the graduates of these programs don't find work, largely because of the restrictive national context and the fact that, I mean, the economy is now completely crumbling, and not even Lebanese citizens find work. And so in that sense, I think the experience is very specific at the moment, that it doesn't necessarily invite us to just blame the digital economy for that, but I think it shows how, and the social experience, I think we showed that in the German example a bit more than what I have done in Lebanon. I know you wanted to ask about Lebanon, but just to give one example of a graduate from the coding school in Berlin, who was extremely highly skilled, worked in, got an internship, a paid internship with a tech company, got a job at another major tech company. He was Syrian. And then, a few months down the road, he got this letter that he's about to be deported, which in the end ended up being sort of an administrative problem that he managed to solve with legal advice. But it definitely shows how the promise of anyone can succeed in a digital economy. It doesn't matter who you are. Sometimes, the legal refugee regime comes back in. And I think in Lebanon, the social experience of having that hope and living in Lebanon now must just be terrible, but then sort of clinging on to those last sources of income that you get is really where some of those digital platform work opportunities come in. And I think that's why they stay relevant as a potential source of emergency relief, if it can be packaged in a way that offers emergency relief. And in Lebanon, I don't know if you've seen Jobs for Lebanon or Jobs for Humanity, which is like a spin-off from Jobs for Lebanon. So they basically try to mobilize the Lebanese diaspora to outsource jobs and offer remote work to people in Lebanon. I don't know how successful it was in the end, but they had a lot of job listings and applicants. And I think there is a growing opportunity here to leverage the potential of remote work and online work as a form of economic relief. But I think that would require a whole new research project for me to answer that.
Well, I hope that you get a chance to have many research projects. And thank you very much for the most fantastic talk, and it generated lots of excitement and lots of questions. And I hope that you enjoyed your visit to the IGP and that we can welcome you again. It's absolutely wonderful. Thank you very, very much. Before we just give you a round of applause, so can the panel please come online so that we can do that? Can I just remind everyone that it would be great if you could please join the staff and the students at the Print Room Cafe UCL for a post-seminar chat. But please remember to remain COVID safe if you do. So can we now just, panel, thank Andreas very much for a wonderful talk. Thank you very much. So that's the virtual thank you, Andreas. And so see you again soon, I hope. Yeah. Bye, everyone. Bye.